Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Felona e Sorona by the band Orme.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Oh dear god, everything that I'm saying in Italian has that English accent to it and it sounds really bad. It's like Felona e Sorona, but I'm saying it like Felona e Sorona, which doesn't sound good. So yeah, anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So somehow, even though we are 277 episodes into the series by this point, I still have yet to have talked about this seminal band in the realm of Italian prog, and that's of course Orme. Now, just as a quick heads up about Orme, the list actually contains yet another album by theirs, and that's their earlier album of Collage. Unfortunately, that will be the only other album by Orme that I'll be reviewing this year, and we will unfortunately not touch on Umo di Pesa this year, but hopefully I'll get to it next year. Nevertheless, today we are reviewing what is probably one of the most genre-defining or sub-genre-defining of Italian prog albums ever, being Felona e Sorona, which translates quite directly into Felona and Sorona. And as much as I'd love to open up this review by telling you the compelling story behind this album's concept, we first of course have to start off with an overview about this band because this is our first time seeing them on the series. So Orme actually formed back in 1966, and much like the rest of a lot of Italian prog bands to come, these guys started off as a psychedelic rock band and then changed their form into the progressive rock at the turn of the decade. And initially the Venice boys actually wanted to call this band Le Ombre, which translates right directly into the shadows, but they instead went with the simpler and still similarly sounding name of Orme. And the band went right ahead and started performing in a live setting, and they even made a request to be partnered with EMI as their record label, which was unfortunately promptly denied. So the band by that point, now consisting of 4 main members, have downscaled their expectations and instead went ahead into studio after signing a record label with the Milan CAR Jukebox record label, and there they recorded 2 singles. And after some notable success with said singles, the band went into the studio in 1968 to record their debut album called Ad Galorium, which was released in 1969. But seeing as most of the band's members were actually quite young at the time and there was a nationwide need in army men, 2 of the band members were recruited to the army and one called Nino Smeraldi just left on personal reasons. And that has left the band with only 1 original member standing, being the original vocalist and bassist Aldo Tagliapietra. And he was joined by 2 new arrivees to the band, the first one being drummer Michi De Rossi and the second one being Tony Pagliqua on the keyboards. I have to stop you right there. You have no idea how many takes I had to do to get all of these names right, and I probably butchered them all. And this lineup would become the classic lineup of the power trio known as Orme. And they were to Italy much like what ELP were to England and Triumvirat to Germany. And these guys would prove themselves supreme when in 1971 they came with a stellar album that is now progressive rock called Collage, and then even outdid themselves in 1972 with another album called Umo di Pesa. And with this album the band would tour around Italy, and they were joined by no other person than Peter Hamill, whose native band for their graph generator was broken up at the time. And while Umo di Pesa was definitely a groundbreaking album, album topping the Italian charts, the band would somehow outdo themselves when in 1973 they released an album so seminal and so good that it literally broke the glass ceiling and became more popular even outside of Italy and around Europe. And that album is of course no other than the one we're reviewing today, being Felona e Sorona. Now remember how I said that Orme and Peter Hammill actually had a personal connection to some extent? Well, this actually lasted to a person called Tony Stratton Smith, who was the manager for Van der Graaf Generator, and he approached Orme with a proposition to release this album with an English version which contained English lyrics, and he would publish it on a nationwide scale. And the band agreed to that proposition, and together working with Peter Hammill, who rewrote all the lyrics in English, the band released this version in 1974, and it was released on a nationwide spread, but it didn't quite garner the same success as the original, considered by many today in hindsight to be the lesser, quite much lesser version of this seminal album. Now for the sake of this review, and because we are going to be revisiting Orme later on in the series, I'm gonna stop right here when it comes to the overall overview of this band, and I'm gonna talk about the album. Now just to make things clear, I listened to the Italian version of this one. I stayed away from the English version. Don't want to know what it's about, don't want to do anything with it, except for one thing, and that's the original lyrics that Peter Hammill wrote for it, because these lyrics proved to be very much helpful when understanding the concept and story behind this album. And the story, well, it goes something like this. So there are two planets, one called Felona and one called Sorona, and Felona is a bright and cheery planet where everyone just lives in a sort of blissful utopia. And at the same time we have Sorona, which is a planet that sits at the opposite edge of the universe and is the planet of darkness, plagues, and overall catastrophe. And the two planets revolve around one another, and despite not stating so consciously, they do long for each other. And above all that, governing it all, there is a god, which he himself is dissatisfied with his own position, having so much strength in his hands and so much responsibility, yet he doesn't want to have all of that power. Now, excuse me, but I will spoil the ending of this album to you all, and let's face it, you don't know Italian, so it's not like you were gonna listen to this one and know what it was about, and it's not that it even matters that much. So the ending of the story is basically that the fates of both planets invert, and now Felona is the dark and gloomy planet and Sorona becomes the happy and cheery planet. Now on its surface, this concept for an album sounds to be one of much oddness and just pure absurdity. Why would anyone choose this one? Honestly, it sounds like something you'd find on an early lyrics version of Pink Floyd's Echoes. If you got that reference, I love you. But personally, I would argue that this is one of the best concepts you could come up for an album, and well, I'll explain why. You see, back when I was in school studying literature and theater, I remember us learning about some plays written by an old Greek dude called Sophocles, and I specifically remember myself just being overall bored by these 2,000-year-old outdated messages written in those plays and not really getting them. But since finishing school, I have self-reflected on those and started thinking to myself, maybe there was more to it, and I started realizing how brilliant these old plays were. And when I listened to today's album, I realized that it was just going on the same lines as all of these old Greek plays. This story, Felona e Sorona, is a story about mankind and the own man himself. Each and every one of us has two opposite poles within ourselves. We have the grotesque, the dark, the gloomy ones, and we have the bright and cheery and very happy ones, and it is all governed by some force, and you might call that a god, you might call it your own brain, who knows, but at the end of things, it is all governed by something. And the story of Felona e Sorona is a story of balance. Every single one longs for the other. The good longs for the bad as well as the bad longing for the good, and there's always has to be some sort of balance which is determined by something, I guess. And there is a moral, I guess, but honestly, I think I'm just dissecting this one too much, but I think that it's a brilliant concept and one that I personally have so much appreciation towards. And the funny thing is, we have been talking on here for so long and I still haven't touched on a single note on this entire album, so let's get right into it and actually review this album for the music to be found on it. So as I said earlier, many people consider this album to be the best album to come out of the Italian prog scene, and well, upon first listening to this album, I really didn't see eye to eye with that statement. But seeing as this album was a measly 33 minutes of runtime, I decided when I finished listening to it that, you know what, I'm gonna listen to it again, why not? I'll try and give it another listen. So I gave it another listen, and another listen, and another listen. You see, before I actually got into this album, I went ahead and checked some reviews and overall summaries of its story. I wanted to get to know what it was about because honestly with these Italian prog albums they can get quite confusing at times, so I wanted to be ready. And something that I probably got into my mind kind of subconsciously was that this album was gonna be the Italian equivalent of what Illusions on a Double Dimple is with Triumvirate, or what Pictures at an Exhibition is with ELP. And honestly, come to think of it, these expectations probably tainted my first reception of this album, but upon further encounters, I actually found out that this one was special on its own regard. So this album opens up with a track called In Between. Now that's of course a translation from Italian, which I'm not gonna try and pronounce. And it's a really good track, probably the best out of the entire album. It showcases everything that is good about the capabilities and skills of the Orme band. And then it is followed up by the track Felona, which basically details the life on the cheery and happy planet, and it does so in a way that you might expect, which is very brightful and cheery. Now Felona is not that much of a progressive track as a whole. It does much the same like a song like Dixie from Harmonie si on avait besoin du cinquième saison. It's not really that progressive, and come to think of it, reading reviews about this one, back in the day when this one came out, a lot of people referred to this one not as progressive rock, although that term really didn't quite exist quite yet, but a lot of people called this psychedelic pop. And honestly, listening to this entire album, I totally get where they're coming from. Now, never mind, from this point onwards, the album does include, I believe, 6 more tracks, but honestly to me, it starts melding into one another, becoming this one fluent piece of music that just goes on until the end. I really don't see myself starting this album and really just cutting it in the middle and going to listen to something else, because this album, once you get into its flow, you really can't get out of it. And I just love the way that it takes inspirations from mainly pop music and jazz music, of course all being overlaid by the overarching ideas of rock music. And as you go through this journey, the lyrics, while you might not understand them because you don't speak Italian, just kind of speak for themselves. They tell a story and you can take it wherever you like. Of course, knowing the original story is a huge benefit and it does make the journey better, but honestly, this is an album where even the singing itself can be considered as some sort of an instrument, considering the amazing voice of Aldo. And personally to me, that's how the album ended, and I just sat there thinking to myself, wow, this is a peculiar album. And I thought about it, I really thought about it. You know, a good piece of art is one that you actually think about when you're done looking or listening to it. So of course, I just thought to myself, well, I'm gonna listen to it just one more time. So if I thought I was done with some lengthy discussions about this album, I certainly wasn't, because we still have to go through this album's cover, which is honestly a miraculous cover that in my opinion encapsulates everything that this album goes to represent just swell. If it wasn't clear already, the 2 planets are just representations of the human being, and of course instead of being represented as planets on here, they are represented as 2 people. Think of it in the sense of how we now call all planets by names of ancient gods, well, the same goes here. They might be planets in our view, but they are actually mythical figures, very much humanoid figures, and that's how they should be represented. And if we take a look at the back side of the cover as well, we can see two faces looking at each other. Of course, we have the couple themselves. The one is bright and the one is darker, though both sharing the same shade of pale blue to purple, you might say, and they are in the opposite ends, just longing for one another. And I think that it's a beautiful cover and it totally encapsulates everything that this album stands for. But before we stop talking about the cover, I firstly just find the need to shed some light on the painter who's responsible for this amazing piece of art called the Franco Frigieri. This amazing Italian surrealist artist made this painting especially and specifically for this album, and as you can see from other works by him, this idea was floating around his head for a good while, and he put it all together in this very interesting cover. So yeah, all in all, this is a very unique, I've never seen anything like this cover, and it's totally matching to the album that it's representing. So this might come as a bit of a surprise to you, seeing as I've been sweet talking this album for a good while now, but I do believe that a proper rating for this one, at least at this point in time, would be very good. 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Liquid Tension Experiment 3 by Liquid Tension Experiment. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay One, Arista Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.